Okay, hello everybody. My name is Nasser Abrahmi. I am the faculty fellow here at the Co-working Center. I just want to start by welcoming everybody. This is our fourth event in the spring semester for our Global Uprising series. And just to sort of recap, as I do every 2 weeks, Global Uprising is a year-long series that really revolves around one fairly simple but central question, which is, how do we rethink collective action from our present? And that's sort of another way of asking, how can we grapple with the present as a time of generalized insurgency? What does it mean to think of it in those terms? That is a present defined in a certain sense by the sheer quantity and frequency of what we might call uprising. And we sort of took the impetus for this rather was the sort of anti-racist uprising that happened last year here in New York and the rest of the country. And we tried to think that along with the 10-year anniversary of what gets called the Arab Spring, for better or worse, but also the renewed waves of uprising that had marked the Middle East and also to a degree Latin America in 2019. So that was a sort of empirical launching point, if you will. Today's session, which is called The Square and the Commune, is the second part in this sort of two-part installation, which we've called Space and Time. And the idea behind these two sessions is we take a sort of more molecular or spatial look at uprising. And today we're doing that around the square and the commune. And in particular, we're trying to think about the square as this sort of privileged site of occupation, encampment, insurrection, and trying to think about whether it's reached its own kind of limit in a certain sense, right? And in parallel, to think about the commune as this sort of corollary, but also alternative spatial figure or imaginary that has kind of returned to political thought. Again, I mean, the commune seems to have many returns, but it's returned again to political thought and imaginary in a pretty powerful way, I think. And to think about how we might relate that to actual histories of encampment and occupation going on around us. And more pressingly, to think about what histories of the commune beyond sort of Eurocentric iterations we need to account for and think about. Of course, the commune is a sort of figure and term so indelibly associated with Paris and the writing on Paris, and that sometimes tends to obscure the much wider and more global history of figurations and incitements of the commune. So part of what we've asked our panelists to consider is what other absented traditions, indigenous, anti-colonial, feminist, anti-racist, we need to consider in contemporary imaginings of the commune, right, or contemporary figurations of the commune. So those are the stakes, kind of broadly speaking: the square, the commune, the return of the commune as this political figure, and how we can sort of widen our repertoire of thought and practice when we consider the commune. Before I get into format, I just want to plug very quickly our other year-long series happening here at the Co-working, which is called Digital Forays. Digital Forays is a sort of very broad a look at what it means to think and act and be in this digital age. The next event in that series is coming up on March 18th, and it's the second installment of digital data gathering and ways of knowing. And this time it's focused on social media. The next event in the Global Uprising series is on the afterlives of uprising. And this one is going to be focused on carcerality, exile, disappearance, and that's coming up on March 23rd. I want to also very quickly thank our colleagues at the Cities Collaborative, at the Institute of Public Knowledge here at NYU and the Urban Democracy Lab for their generous co-sponsorship. We are very grateful for their support. So in terms of our format, it will be as usual. Each of our panelists will have about 10 minutes to sort of lay out an intervention, responding broadly to the prompts, thinking about the wider stakes, and then we will turn to our discussant, who will facilitate a sort of round of question and answer between the panelists for about another 20-25 minutes, and then we'll turn to the wider audience, to you all, and invite you to engage and ask questions. And I just want to remind everyone that you can ask questions in a number of ways. You can raise your hand during the sort of open Q&A session, but you can also type in questions into the chat box at any point. You don't have to wait to the kind of final, that Q&A bit. If you have a question that comes up, you can pose it at any time, and we will try to relay as many of the questions as possible. I want to also mention that the events are recorded. They are available on our YouTube page for people if they want to look at them afterwards. And I also going to briefly mention that we end at 2, but we tend to have a small period of debrief and sort of, just sticking together and letting things unwind naturally rather than a very abrupt cut. So if you want to linger on after 2, no one is obliged to do so, but you're welcome to that. So our speakers, we have really 4 brilliant and very committed activists and scholars with us today. And their sort of interests and ethical and political engagements really span the globe in terms of their focuses. So we're very grateful and happy to have them with us here. And I'm going to give very brief, sort of lightning quick introductions to everyone in alphabetical order and in order of appearance. There are more full bios on our website, and they can be linked in the chat if anyone wants to go and have a look at that. But in order of appearance, Joshua Clover is a professor of English at the University of California, Davis. He works between critical theory, Marxism, political theory, and poetry and poetics. His most recent book is Riot, Strike, Riot, The New Era of Uprisings. Dean Itsuji Saranio is an associate professor of social and cultural analysis here at NYU. He works between Indigenous studies, settler colonial studies, cultural studies, Asian American studies. He's published a series of essays in American Quarterly, Journal of Asian American Studies, and a whole host of anthologies, and is currently working on a manuscript on the admission of Hawaii as a US state. Nazan Ustandag is a fellow at the Gerda Henkel Stiftung Patrimonies Program. She works on social policy, gender, and state violence. Her most recent articles appeared in the South Atlantic Quarterly and the History of the Present. And she's finishing a manuscript titled Mother, Politician, and Guerrilla, the Emergence of a New Political Cosmology in Kurdistan Through Women's Bodies and Speech. And our discussant, who we're very grateful to have with us today, is Lenora Hansen, an assistant professor of English at NYU. Their work focuses on Romantic era and contemporary literature, subsistence practices, and anti-capitalist ways of living. And their current book project is titled History Dispossessed, Romanticism and the Rhetoric of Accumulation. So I'm going to shut up now. I'm going to hand it over to Joshua and get us started.
Hi, everyone. I have a slideshow that I'm going to sort of informally talk through. So let me get that started. If assuming it all works out right, which is always sort of a risk. Okay. I want to sort of get right into it, but I will first mention what an honor it is to be here among friends. And in this August crowd, some of whom are new to me, and at least one of whom is an old comrade. The last time Nora and I did a thing together, it was the day after Trump's election. How much has changed since that time? That's Marx's favorite phrase from Virgil, complete with his ironic sense of how little had changed. In talking about the Commune, we're talking about a history both fleeting and durable, but one which exists objectively, which is to say largely autonomous from the parade of presidents and policy maneuvers. We're 9 days from the 150th anniversary of the Paris Commune, which deserves celebration both because of its actual working existence and as a source of hope. At the same time, we're all tasked with deprovincializing that episode toward inhabiting a fuller history of the Commune in the past and in the future and even in the present. And I do not want to do so by gesturing at other episodes, which are deserving of our recognition, but by thinking about the Commune first in structural terms. So I'm going to start with political economic relations, at first very simply, even remedially, and try to move from this to matters of strategy and tactics, to forms of struggle. I'm going to show a bunch of slides pretty swiftly. My goal is to rise from the abstract to the concrete, to arrive about 10 minutes from now at 2 things. On the one hand, the opposition between insurrection and commune that animates this gathering, and on the other, some concrete struggles that I think point toward an overcoming of this opposition. My focus is on Turtle Island in the last decade, but I hope my conjectures are at least somewhat portable. That's what you get from structure, I hope. And I'll start with the simplest, which is Marx's formula for capital, which is well known, of course, the MCM circuit. It's worth mentioning that that has two moments in it, right? The transformation of money into commodities, and then the commodities entrance into the world market in search of more money. And those two moments provide what we can call the two spheres of capital, production and circulation. And those are spheres in fairly elaborate senses. They don't refer purely to activities, but to sort of modes of life. Circulation in particular is often sort of misrecognized as referring only to the transport of goods and things like this. Deb Cohen, who's one of the great thinkers of the logistical turn, notes that circulation cannot be understood as simply or immediately physical mobility in the way the term is often used today. It is rather the transformation of value into different forms that constitutes the circulation of capital. And I would add, just as the sphere of production designates physical and social arena where production takes place, the sphere of circulation designates the physical and social arena where these other transformations of exchange and consumption take place. So the market, the square, the street, and so on. When you act in your guise as a market-dependent person, you are in the sphere of circulation. And as one might suspect, these two spheres have their own sort of genres of struggle, as I'm going to call them, production struggles and circulation struggles. One trying to assert control over or conditions within the sphere of production, the other trying to assert control over conditions within the sphere of circulation. As soon as we draw them that way, it seems to occupy all of social space. But I want to note that that's not the case and look at two other spheres that are interlinked. One is sort of the sum of those two spheres, right, of production and circulation, which in whole gets that technical name, the reproduction of capital. But as soon as we name that, right, we have to include the other circuit, which is the reproduction of the proletariat that follows the logic, not of MCM, but CMC, where you have to sell your labor power in some way, shape, or form to get money, to get commodities to survive, to sell your labor power again. And these two circuits depend on each other for their mutual existence. And as you would guess, the circuit of reproduction has its own genre of struggles, which I'll call reproduction struggles. So those are our three genres of struggle within the full elaboration of capital across the globe, across social space, which are production struggles, circulation struggles, and reproduction struggles. And though each one has several different tactics within it, each one has an exemplary tactic, right? The one that sort of is most well known, most spectacular, historically perhaps most successful. For circulation struggles, it's the riot, or arguably the insurrection. From a structural position, I'm not sure the name matters much, although there's been much contestation over whether to call events rebellions, uprisings, insurrections, riots, and so on. For production struggles, along with struggles such as sabotage and slowdown and so on, the strike is the exemplary form of struggle. And for reproduction struggles, the exemplary form is the commune. So that in some sense is the sum total of the case I want to make today, is that when we talk about the commune, we're not talking about a specific historic episode, whether it be Paris or Shanghai or Morelos or Oaxaca or various other historical examples. We're talking about a structural position, which is the struggle for control over a community's, a collective's reproduction without reference to production or circulation, which is to say independent of the wage and the market, right? So a community's struggle for reproduction of itself independent of wage and market is what I'm calling a commune. And so we now sort of have our three forms of struggle: the riot, strike, commune, my big trilogy. But of course, if graphicalizing them that way ignores the fact that they're actually kind of overlapping, can be a little bit hard to disentangle, are a bit heterogeneous. And in particular, I want to look at the pairing that is with us today, which is that of riot and commune. We have slightly different language for them in the prompt for today's discussion, which I'll pull up now, right? Our age of uprising has also been an age of insurrection. That's the riot. And yet for all their sublime spectacularity, insurrections seem to reach their own limit. In this context, the figure of the commune has returned to political thought almost as a line of flight. So we have riot and commune, and as noted in the sort of final question for today's discussion, how do we think about this tension between insurrection and autonomy? And I want to focus on that for the last couple minutes. And one of the things I want to suggest is while that tension is there, especially if we formulate matters in this particular way of sort of political desire for autonomy and so on, the tension might be less there if we look at things from this sort of structural circumstance. Now, what do I mean by that? I want to now move to a couple concrete examples. What you're looking at right now is a simple blockade of a railroad track conducted after Black Diamond Coal went out of business and refused to pay their miners their last month's salary. And because there was no business left to strike, the workers couldn't go on strike, and so decided they would blockade the train tracks to prevent the last shipments of coal from going into market and trying to compel Black Diamonds to pay them their final salaries. So this is a blockade, right? It's a circulation struggle. This picture looks fairly modest, but that's good news, right? It doesn't take very many people to block a train track, and that's an important fact to remember. But I want to point out not just the people on the track, but those tents over to the side. And I think the relevance of this will become fairly important in a second as I shift to another scene. This is the blockade at Standing Rock. It's part of the No DAPL movement. Seen from the side of the blockaders, I think it's important to look at photographs from that side rather than photographs looking from the military side at the blockaders. So this is a blockade. It's a classic circulation struggle in the sense that we've talked about. But what's important to note is that that blockade doesn't exist without the massive encampment that goes alongside it, right? There's the Standing Rock encampment, and you can't really have one without the other. And this, I think, gets us to that question of tension between the commune, that is to say the reproduction struggle, and the blockade, that is to say the circulation struggle. In this situation of the infrastructural blockade, they're not in tension at all. In fact, they form a unity. They're not even two separate things. They're a single activity, right? You can't have the blockade unless there's that reproductive unit, that sort of proto-commune that is the encampment. And you don't get the encampment unless there's the occasion for a blockade. So that sort of preliminary commune and that blockade, that infrastructure, that circulation struggle only exist insofar as they exist together as a single unit. Each one implies and requires the other. And this helps us not just overcome the purported opposition between insurrection and commune, but also a series of other oppositions that have arisen which also deserve examination. For example, the proposed opposition between militancy and care, right, which is often offered as an opposition, often offered as a gendered opposition, with one treated as masculinized, one treated as feminized. And as we see, like in this moment, right, these two activities are moments of a single struggle. They're not in opposition, they form this unity. And I think that unity, the ability for the circulation struggle and the reproduction struggle, the insurrection and the commune, to proceed together, not in opposition, not as binary options, but as a political, economic, and tactical strategic unity, points toward a potential way forward for struggle in the present, particularly as the economy more and more depends on rapid extractivism. There are reasons, of course, that this is fundamentally an indigenous tradition in Turtle Island, because of the history of land dispossession and the land-based character of these struggles. It's not an indigenous tradition necessarily worldwide. There's quite amazing blockades in Germany, but it is in various other places, New Zealand, Australia, for example. This is an indigenous tradition. So I just want to offer this particular tradition indigenous-based in much of the world, engaged and thoughtful about ecological questions of climate collapse, and unifying the insurrection and the commune as a source for political optimism. Thank you very much. I'm happy to pass things along to my colleagues and betters. And let me take off the screen sharing.
Thank you so much, Joshua. I'm going to turn it over to Dean.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Everyone can hear me? So I'm really grateful to be here and grateful to be following Joshua's presentation, because I think a lot of what I'm going to say is going to echo what Joshua just said, and he laid out such a beautiful framework for understanding these things. I'm speaking to you today from Southern California in what is the traditional territories of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. And I guess let me begin by referencing Noelani Goodyear Kaupua's wonderfully rich book, and she has a lot of books. But the one book that I keep returning to is a book titled The Seed We Planted, Portraits of a Native Hawaiian Charter School. And so Noelani is a professor. She's a Aloha Aina activist. Aloha Aina literally translates as love for the land, and is a form of patriotism or understanding of patriotism, a kind of patriotism. And she's also an educator. She also helped to found Halau Kumana, which is a school in urban Honolulu that uses indigenous knowledge to structure curriculum that, among other things, teaches their secondary students how to grow and prepare their own food. I think this is maybe kind of tied to that argument about the creation of a commune or autonomous zone that is tied to Oslo blockades. But this form of education is I think what I understand to be a form of slow resistance. Like it's a way of thinking about producing a kind of resistance that allows for future generations to succeed, perhaps in ways in which our current generation cannot. But it's also about kind of building other kinds of grids, other forms of infrastructure. And so they teach their students how to grow, prepare their own food. Teachers and students together restored awai, which are intricate irrigation systems, and lo'ikalo, which are stone terrace farms, in an area named Aihualama. And so together they utilize this living space to imagine with students other worlds of possibilities. So for instance, by having students track the hours required to maintain one lo'i to harvest, students learn that the lo'i required only 15 to 25 hours of work per month to feed oneself. I'll say that again. It required only 15 to 25 hours of work per month to feed oneself. Together they ponder, if this were to include loko i'a, which are fish ponds, how much land would be required to feed all of Hawaii? So after a year of work, the number they come up with is 16,000 acres, only 1.6% of the so-called ceded lands, which are Hawaiian government lands that were seized during the 1893 US military-backed overthrow and currently held in trust by the state of Hawaii on behalf of Kanaka Uiwi. And so Hawaii, besides being occupied by the United States, also imports 85 to 90% of all of its food, which is a dangerous precedent, being 2,500 miles away from the US West Coast, and particularly as extreme weather patterns increase. And just look at the amount of hurricanes and its devastating impact on the Caribbean. And has been noted by others, 40% of all greenhouse gases contributing to climate change are caused by industrial agricultural models, which require transporting foods across long distances. And so the work of Noelani Goodyear Kaupua and many others aims to cultivate more mutually beneficial relationships across communities by planting the seeds for indigenous economies to re-emerge, literally growing economies, and thus offering a plurality of possibilities that might emerge when Hawaii residents work in place-based affinity with Kanaka Uiwi. As opposed to a colonialist notion that indigenous peoples are stuck in the past, Goodyear Kaupua shows how native movements and educational work addresses current problems and provides alternative futures. By rebuilding Hawaiian governance, foodways, and economies, they create and imagine alternative power relations to settler colonialism. So as she states, quote, "The marginalization and suppression of indigenous knowledges has gone hand in hand with the transformation and degradation of indigenous economic systems and the ecosystems that nourish us. Conversely, settler colonial relations might be transformed by rebuilding in new ways the indigenous structures that have historically sustained our societies." And so one of the main aims of settler colonialism is to eliminate alternatives to itself. So as such, US imperialism has often made Native peoples vulnerable by disrupting those human to non-human familial relations. So this is a tactic of native dispossession, whether it's targeting kalo or taro in Hawaii through water expropriation. Joshua mentioned the Lakota at Standing Rock and the US Army's elimination of the buffalo, numbering 15 million in 1871 and only 34 by 1903. The genetic modification of corn, wild rice, taro, and salmon in the Pacific Northwest are military tactics that target the elimination of food sources and ecosystems, as was done in the Philippine-American War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the latter two using herbicides such as Agent Orange, and the continued use of depleted uranium by various militaries and weapons that are not only destructive, but obviously cause intense environmental harm. This is obviously an incomplete index. But in the death of these non-human relations is the continual birth and rebirth of capitalism, the particular mode of production that has evolved to set the current environmental conditions of climate crisis. And so given this, the renewal and protection of human and non-human relations can move us towards a more sustainable, healthy, and equitable system for all. And so talking about indigenous resurgence often leads to dismissals of romanticism. And so let me just share a story about some of the organizing that my great-grandparents who first traveled from Cebu in the Philippines to Hawaii in 1919, the kind of work that they participated in. So in 1951, on the rural island of Lanai, primarily Filipino laborers organized a strike. And the pineapple industry refused a raise for their workers, and all Hawaiian Pine ILWU units, except those from the island of Lanai, ratified the contract. And so deciding to go out on strike alone, Lanai strikers were openly mocked by ILWU leaders. ILWU leadership pointed out that the 1947 strike had the entire support of the ILWU and failed after lasting for only 5 days. The Lanai strike in total lasted far beyond what was imaginable to ILWU leaders, totaling not 5 days, but 201 days. People say that you could smell the unharvested and rotting pineapples from the west side of Maui, from another island. And so at the first meeting, after voting to go out on strike, the chairman of the strike strategizing committee, Pedro de la Cruz, whom ILWU leaders described as a, quote, man who couldn't talk, began by asking those in attendance to divide themselves according to those who knew how to fish, those who knew how to hunt, and those who knew how to plant. And these three committees were charged with feeding the strikers. Furthermore, according to Noboru Oyama, a Hawaiian pineapple company manager at the time who I interviewed, Filipino laborers by the 1930s had already established the Federation Camp, a fishing village with homes made entirely out of driftwood and scrap lumber, but more importantly, capable of subsisting entirely through fishing and planting. Indeed, much of the marine life in Hawaii was already familiar to them from the Philippines. My great-grandparents, Sebastian Crispina Bibiloni, were a part of this camp. And so the strike strategizing committee, with the support of the Federation Camp, had utilized a wholly different strategy from that of the ILWU leaders, one that allowed their resistance to be literally fed from the land. And the strategy of the Lanai workers was considered so brilliant that plantation managers believed it was developed by the ILWU union leaders, not the Lanai laborers themselves. Ultimately, the Lanai strike won, receiving more than their original demand and securing industry-wide bargaining with all pineapple workers receiving the same benefits as the Lanai strikers. The strike is remembered as a happy strike, where workers were able to live not according to the regimen of the plantation, and had in fact built a large bamboo structure where more than 300 were able to communally share their meals. Such alternative histories not only articulate indigenous and labor aims together, but build on past struggles in ways that allow non-native peoples to be accountable to present Kanaka Uiwi movements that engage in the alternative worlds that are often disqualified as nonsensical. And so when I spoke about this strike to Luis Francia, who teaches Tagalog at NYU and is a historian, culture critic, poet, and playwright, he said he hadn't heard of that strike on Lanai, but he has heard of that same tactic being used in the Visayas in the Philippines against the Spanish, where anti-colonial campaigns would begin by finding resource-rich lands that could feed their resistance. And so this knowledge and wisdom of the conditions of life that are taught to the youth, like the pedagogy offered at Halau Kumana, provide real-world implications. The Kanaka Uivi word ea, defined as but not limited to breath, life, sovereignty, and autonomy, helps to contextualize or conceptualize, another worldview that ties material and political autonomy together at one of the basic necessities of life, that is breath. Ea can be looked at in terms of replacing the genocidal conditions of sovereignty, but it also has implications for labor, where Skippy Ioane, a longtime Hawaiian activist, describes ea as waking up in the morning and deciding whether or not you go to work. And I think this is a kind of freedom that is unimaginable to many of us. And so, but the current issue in Hawaii, and there are many fronts that are being organized against, but perhaps the most galvanizing issue currently is tied to protecting sacred Mauna Awakea. And so Hawaii, and this issue is tied to many of the issues I just spoke about. So Hawaii state leaders continue to disregard growing numbers of people united in protecting sacred Mauna Awakea, one of the most sacred places in Hawaii, from further desecration by the 30-meter telescope. And Kia'i, or protectors, Ilima Long, who was one of the core organizers, was also a speaker in this series. But they continue to inspire and further demonstrate to all of Hawaii the power of indigenous movements to create meaningful alternatives to an unsustainable US colonial system. Despite pro-TMT supporters who paint the movement to protect Mauna Awakea as anti-science or as coming at the expense of non-Hawaiians, it is the Mauna Kea movement in Hawaii that is tied, that is to the greatest benefit to all of Hawaii's people. Together, they are redefining what is even imagined as possible, as they have created a kind of autonomous zone by organizing numerous fronts of mutual care at the Puhonua relating to education, childcare, medical care, ride shares, waste recycling, and food. And because of COVID, the number of people present has declined, but there still exists a presence on guard protecting Mauna Kea. And those protecting the Mauna, or the mountain, have also forged powerful connections with other global movements who similarly understand the urgency to protect the very conditions that sustain life on this planet. Uncle Walter Riddy, who at the time was 74 years old, chained himself to a cattle grate along with Noelani Gudikaupu, who I mentioned at the beginning, and 6 others for more than 15 hours to block the construction equipment from reaching the summit of Mauna Kea and building the 30-meter telescope. While chained, Uncle Walter Riddy explained that there's not much difference between the fight for Ko'olave, where they protected the island from military bombing, and protecting Mauna Kea. He said, quote, "They were killing an island. I'm up here because this is the last stand. We don't have enough food in the ocean anymore. The tourists have taken all of our coastlines, poisoning all of our farmlands. Now they're trying to take our most sacred mountains. Where the hell are we going to go after this? This is the last stand. I mean, we cannot give up this mountain." So the 30-meter telescope epitomizes the failure of settler colonialism, which has the intellectual capacity to peer into the universe, but lacks any wisdom to protect life on this planet. Imai Kalani Winchester, a kumu or teacher at Halo Kumana, the charter school I mentioned earlier, who also committed himself to being chained at the category to block TMT construction equipment, argued that they weren't necessarily blocking the road, but rather opening other roads, opening other worlds for liberatory possibilities and alternative futures from US occupation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dean. I'm gonna turn it over to Nazan.
Thank you. So I'm very happy to be here and yeah, to share, to be together with you all. So my talk is going to be a little bit less analytical and more experimental, I think. And I hope that I will be able to express some of my concerns. I will also take issue with the opposition or with the tension that has been put forth in the prompt. But from a different perspective. What I want to do is I want to question some of the assumptions it makes, or some of the assumptions it makes me think that have played themselves out in our interpretation of the squares and its aftermath. And here, I must say, I'm basing my analysis primarily on what we have experienced in the Middle East, which I believe is relevant for understanding other contexts, but still different, with its own distinctive dimensions. Okay, so in the prompt, as Joshua has already showed it, it says, to add to the weakness of organized labor, insurrectionary forms of blockade and occupation, our so-called movement of the squares, signaled most emphatically by the name Tahrir, themselves seem mired in a kind of fatal cycle of reenactment. I want to question this part of the prompt because as I read it, it gives the impression that when insurgency, which should be actually a brief moment in time, is prolonged, it inevitably becomes suicidal, calling for its own demise or defeat. I'm not sure that this is the right way of putting things. The square, in my opinion, and especially in the Middle East, in Turkey, in Egypt, did not mire in a kind of fatal reenactment, but rather became defeated. It lost a war. It became repressed. And I think it is important to use these words when we think about insurgency and our recent history in the Middle East and elsewhere. So people who participated, and I see that in the next panel, you will talk about some of these things. People who participated in it became jailed, terrorized, forced to exile. In other words, we could not, I mean, in the square, the problem of the square, in my opinion, as an activist and theorist, theorist, oh my God, what an ambitious word, sociologist, observant, but whatever, not theorist, sorry for that, is the fact that we could not defend ourselves against the state and its military establishment. So there wasn't anything suicidal in the square, anything that came to a limit. People were happy, people were continuing there because they were able to generate immediately, as Joshua has shown, forms of care, sustenance, and relationality among themselves, and which, as COVID-19 showed us, are the only things that matter, are the only things that are necessary for survival. So this is what I want to bring to the table today, the perspective of self-defense, and open up the following question. Shouldn't we, at this point of time, and in light of our recent experience, mostly be concerned with how to make sure that the state loses its power to kill, to arrest, to exile, to forcibly disappear, and to forcibly displace? This, I would argue, is exactly what the organization and experience of indigenous people, women, and anti-colonial and anti-racist movements teach us. I mean, these not only with their victories, but more even with the defeats they have faced, with the ways in which they have lost this, lost these different struggles. And we should not be afraid of, I think, using these words. So I will come back maybe to that in a second with a life story that I want to share with you. But I want to just continue, just say one more thing. Again, the prompt says that the square, when the square disappeared from the horizon of opposition, sorry, in this context, that is, I interpret the context where the square disappears from the horizon of oppositional politics as a real possibility, the figure of the commune has returned to political thought almost as a line of flight, an exit from the square to more prosaic but durable forms of association. I'm again not sure whether the figure of commune constituted a flight or exit from the square. The commune, in thought at least, I would say, in my opinion, emerged as a means to think about how to continue the life discovered in the square, which owed its appeal to the stateless space the moment of insurgency created there. But even with the communes, again, especially in the Middle East, the same problem of defense resurfaced. How to really create communes when we do not have the means to defend them from militarized states. And of course, also the question of how to disseminate our communal imaginations in an environment where military fantasies and their sovereign aura dominate the cultural scape. I think it is here again that we need to learn from feminist, post-colonial, anti-racist, and indigenous movements, because since their emergence, their #1 issue has been how to defend themselves, their values, their wealth, their thought, and their intimacies from the usurpation of man, colonizers, and white supremacy. Now, I watched, it coincided beautifully with this panel, actually. I watched yesterday this film, Judas and the Black Messiah, about the Black Panthers, and their attempt to make communes provide care and provide medical care mostly to their neighborhoods, and how they built coalitions with across race and across ethnicity. And then in the end, as you all know, of course, they become, most of them become jailed, and several of them get killed. And I must say, times are not different. When I was watching this, I thought about Egypt, Turkey, Kurdistan. A recent film made by the Rojava Film Commune, for example, shows how in 2015, this time, the Turkish state commits a massacre against the Kurdish youth who declare autonomy. And I wish we could show these films together and talk about them. You know, what happens here? I want to conclude my intervention by evoking the name of a friend, Nejat Arnaslı, a graduate from the sociology department at Boğaziçi University, where I taught until 3 years ago. He's dead now, and that's why I want to evoke his name as much as possible, because I keep thinking together with him. Nejat was a fierce communist and communalist who actually developed his own theory of autonomy and communism in an anonymous book he published in internet, and for him, autonomy meant the deconstitution of the social created by biopower. In that sense, I mean, if we take autonomy to mean this, then insurgency and autonomy are not in tension at all, because without insurgency, there is no commune, and without commune, without the sustenance that the commune produced, there is no insurgency, and not only sustenance and care, but also the thinking space that it talks about. In any case, Nejat was, of course, very active in Gezi occupation, and once the protests were repressed, he joined the Kurdish People's Defense Unit as a Turkish internationalist in northeast Syria, and died while defending the city of Kobane against ISIS invasion. In a letter he left behind, he said that he was going to Kobane to find his Neverland, since during that time and still now, Kurds in northeast Syria have been aware and have been experimenting with democratic autonomy and communalism. And I am guessing that many of you are by now familiar with this experiment. Now, I am evoking Nejat's name for 3 reasons in this panel. First reason is, of course, the debt that we owe to our comrades in arms who died while trying to extend the insurrective moment we experienced in the Middle East and reconstituted themselves through the desires articulated in that moment. They are the ghosts with which we now dwell in this new world we have created, along with Fred Hampton's and Che Guevara's and all. The second reason is the fact that Nejat's final years can be read as the shift from insurrection to commune and then defense, which I think the prompt leaves out. His leaving Turkey, a site of insurrection, to Kobane was indeed a flight from the square to durable forms of association, because as I said, in Turkey we were defeated, but in Rojava there was a space now opened So, I mean, there is also this geographical mobility. So that the experiment with democratic autonomy in Rojava or Northeast Syria promised. Finally, the third reason that I'm evoking his name is when Nejat went to Kobane and joined the People's Defense Units, he took the name Paramaz Kızılbaş. His first name, Paramaz, he took in reference to an Armenian freedom fighter, communist, writer, communalist, who proposed the idea of federation of autonomous space in the Ottoman Empire. And he was hanged right in the beginning of the genocide in 1915 in the then central square of Istanbul. And Kızılbaş, the surname Nejat took, makes reference to the heretic Alevi religion in Turkey and the genocides that they encountered by the Turkish state. So in his last days, Nejat turned himself into a palimpsest of memories, imaginations, insurgencies, and potentialities. My question again, and I cannot not ask this question, 7 years after his death, how could we have defended him? And his school friend Cihat, who died 1 year after him, this time killed by the Turkish state while defending Kurdish autonomy. So these questions, I must say, prompted, I mean, these are the questions that came to my mind when I was reading your paragraph. And I believe we are at a moment in history, maybe I mean, where we need abolition. There is no other way. We need abolition. And there is no way that we can counter these apocalyptic times with limits imposed on our imagination, memory, and experiments. We need stateless spaces and means to defend them. And to defend ourselves, we must name a collective horizon. And this horizon, I think, is the collectivization and consequently naturalization of the means of violence through the abolition of police, military, and the prison system. Thank you.
Thank you, Nazan. Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over to Lenora, who will respond and facilitate kindly a discussion. I just want to remind everyone that after that, we'll be moving to the general kind of Q&A, and you can post questions before then in the chat box. So over to you, Lenora.
Great, thank you. I'm incredibly honored to be in conversation with you all. And yeah, thank you for the invitation. I was just reflecting as Joshua said that about the last time that we were together being before the elections, and that also brought to mind that the last time I think I was in touch with you was to get books this summer for an abolitionist encampment. And Dean, I was working with Dean over the summer over housing issues. So it also feels like a really nice moment to reflect on the different kind of work that's going on under the umbrella of all these kinds of social reproduction that people are talking about. So a little bit of a brighter memory. So yeah, I guess I'm just gonna put some framing thoughts together based on what everyone said and try to draw out some connections, but also maybe potentially some tensions that might be worth reflecting on. I guess just to say first, I was really happy to see everyone kind of trouble the binary or the dichotomy that was kind of being drawn in the framing of the questions, you know, and troubling the kind of difference or absolute difference between, say, insurrection and commune or something like that. It was really powerful, concrete, on the ground examples that people were giving that show us that these are not just entangled, but necessarily entangled, that insurrection can't be separated from commune if a commune is to generate some kind of autonomy. right, based on the immense state repression and based on the absolute need of social reproduction that a commune would face or does face. So I guess I just wanted to highlight some alternative terms that maybe came out of the discussion, everyone's pieces, everyone's discussions, that might help us get outside of and produce some different vocabularies. I was just reading an old Ivan Ilyich piece called The War on Subsistence, which is all about kind of producing, the importance of producing new vocabularies. So the terms that I thought that were like really coming out of everyone's pieces that could get us away from this kind of binaristic framework of insurrection and commune, right, would be the kind of language of social reproduction that Joshua is talking about, the language of self-defense that Nizana is bringing up, and then really interestingly, this language of kind of subsistence and the reproduction of subsistence cultures and subsistence ways of living that Dean, you were mentioning in relation to and in context of labor struggles. So these all seem like really useful keywords, maybe to keep in mind as we kind of break down the tension that everyone was kind of talking about in their pieces. And these are also, I think, like really helpful in getting away maybe from the term of autonomy, which can carry a lot of Eurocentric baggage, as the framing mentioned. So maybe thinking through the lens of social reproduction, self-defense, subsistence helps us to step away from a strong version of autonomy, you know, that suggests in a lot of cases a self-determination that just has too many roots in nationalism or too many roots in sovereignty. So I guess some questions that I wanted to ask you guys about some potential gaps or tensions across thinking spheres of like social reproduction, self-defense, and subsistence as some important terms in struggle today would be maybe the complications around the historical dimensions of social reproduction as they filter into or creep into sites of struggle. So Joshua, you were showing those really amazing images of kind of the tents that are set up around these active sites of struggle. And I was reading some of Nizan's work prior to this just to kind of prepare a little bit. And part of what struck me about your work, Nizan, is this intense attention to the ways that, you know, hierarchical forms of power, patriarchy, the kinds of things in which the air that we breathe on our day-to-day lives filter into and always risk filtering into the commune, the camp, those spaces of ostensibly more democratic organization. So I was just wondering if any of you wanted to or could speak to the work that has to be done, like the ongoing work that has to be done inside the space of the commune, inside the space of democratic spaces, to, you know, not just resist outside repression, but to break down the continuous kind of reestablishment of hierarchy, reestablishment of gender oppression, racial oppression internally, you know, inside of our spaces, let's say. So how do we deal with that kind of historical problem? I guess the second question I was going to pose kind of has to do with maybe a possible tension between the eventual imaginary that we all have around insurrection, the kind of spectacularity of it, and the cultures of kind of subsistence reproduction that Dean was highlighting for us. And I guess like one question that comes out of this for me is one, like why is it that the commune seems like such a desirable social word or a desirable political term, but subsistence doesn't show up as much in conversations about what social reproduction outside of the state would look like, or what social reproduction outside of capitalism would look like. Like, what are the still historical and primitivist residues or something that are clinging to subsistence that make it not as sexy, maybe, as thinking about the commune. And kind of along, so this is the last question that I'll end on which is related to the subsistence question. How do you approach the difference between organized and unorganized modes of subsistence? I mean, this has been a question that has plagued feminist criticism and feminist work for a long time, right? Like what looks like a politics of social reproduction in the household doesn't necessarily look like a strike, doesn't necessarily take the visible forms of politics that are more spectacular. So, you know, what do we do with the a tension that exists between constantly ongoing and necessary forms of, let's say, unorganized, I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but unorganized modes of subsistence, unorganized modes of social reproduction, and these kinds of more visibly organized, in the sense of the commune or at the blockade, forms of subsistence, forms of social reproduction. Like, what do we do with the gap between those two things? Or not two, you know, I don't want to create a binary, but what do we do with the need to transition one into the other, or to kind of mediate that gap, I guess. So those are the questions that I had. I mean, I can run over them in a more systematic fashion if people want them with a little bit less digression, but those were the kind of main questions that were coming out to me that might kind of connect a lot of what you all were saying, while also kind of maybe opening up some space for differences.
So, I mean, does anyone want to start? We can just go around in the same order. If I think that's probably the easiest, unless someone wants to jump in.
That's fine. I can do the duty of being the first goer, and hopefully just say some very, very crude things that other people can develop in more refined fashion. I'm going to try and speak to two of those questions. I kind of think the third, I mean, first of all, thanks for the questions. I'm always grateful to be in conversation with Nora, who always has insights that have helped me do my own thinking. And those three questions do so. I think the third one is probably pretty closely related to the second one, at least in my conception. So I'm going to sort of try and sketch out quick answers to the first two, and then pass the mic. So regarding the sort of the tendency or inevitability for various kinds of subordinations to appear within the borders of the commune, the struggle in general, A, I don't think anyone should take that as a surprise. B, I'm a communist, right? But I'm not one of those communists who thinks like, once we do away with labor exploitation, all the other like subordinations and hierarchies and inequalities will vanish because they're epiphenomenal. Like, that's obviously nonsense, and I leave it to, you know, DSA Philadelphia to believe those things. So I don't think it's any surprise that those things enter in and persist. And I also think we have to be careful about how we relate to them, which is to say, for me, like, one of the reasons I take this sort of structural approach, which allows, I mean, one of the reasons is I can show charts and graphs, but one of the reasons is it helps me get away from the temptations of ethical thinking, right? Which I think in many ways, like, really has plagued Rojava, for example, where some people refuse to engage the incredibly important struggle in Rojava because it's in some sense not perfect. And they can point to some example of like some ethical failing they find there to reject. And I don't think that's a useful approach, right? It's once we accept that there's all kinds of subordinations, all kinds of contradictions, they're going to persist unevenly, that we can't measure struggles by whether they have magically overcome all of them in their first step, right, of saying we're a commune or whatever. Once we get away from that ethical position, we turn to this really practical problem, which is often described as having to fight the revolution within the revolution, right? Or the struggle within the struggle. Most dramatically in the fact that historically, many liberatory movements have at least started with, and we see this in the present, right? With the presence of people who have pretty reactionary or even fascist leanings that catch a hold of a populist moment and have to be excised from your movement. This happened really interestingly in the Gilets Jaunes movement in France, for example. And you have to fight that struggle against patriarchy, against white supremacy, against all of these subordinations that are going to continue even within a moment of looking for a different social organization, a more liberatory or emancipatory horizon. You're going to have to fight that struggle with people there as well as people outside. And being aware of that just seems to me important and straightforward. About the sort of what you call the evental imaginary around insurrection, I think one of the ways I've tried to get around that, I know what you mean, certainly, in a kind of fetishizing of intense spontaneism or so on, is a couple of ways. One is to reject the idea that what we call riots or insurrections are entirely spontaneous, they have no organizational principles within them, that they have no durability or duration, which I don't think is true. But another way is to displace them into that larger genre of the circulation struggle, of which the riot is merely, or the insurrection is merely an example. And once you displace it into that, you have more of a sense of a duration of the blockade. You talk about what Dean was talking about, which is like a really interesting example of an infrastructural blockade against that fucking telescope. And that has had a really intense duration to it. That it can't really be thought eventually in the sense of like the one night riot. And so that category of the circulation struggle helps me overcome the opposition between the seemingly non-durational moment of the riot and the deeply durational moment of the blockade and the commune and so on and so forth. So I'll end by sort of talking about that question of like sexiness. I think the sexiness of the commune diminishes greatly when you describe it as figuring out a way to reproduce your community over a long period of time without reference to marketable wages. And that's perilously close to subsistence and talking about that. And you sort of have to accept that. I think that the problem is that if you don't talk about subsistence, there's this temptation to have a kind of accelerationist, fully automated luxury communism view of like, well, subsistence before capitalism, that was a huge drag. We don't want to go back to that. Fuck those anti-civ people. The cool thing about the commune and communism is we're going to use all the technologies we've developed and really do away with work, and we're going to mine asteroids and sleep until very late in the day. And there's a million ways that is not going to happen, and only one is needed. So I think you're right, like reckoning with the fact that a world after capitalism, and this goes to all your questions, right, is going to involve ongoing struggles against other kinds of subordination that are going to persist, and is going to involve a recognition that actual hard expenditure of energy is still going to be required. It's just not going to be labor domination, and that's going to be great. Moreover, I think abandoning the profit logic is going to decrease the amount of work people have to do, but there's still going to be a lot of cooking and cleaning to take care of, and we got to be ready to do that, y'all. Thanks.
Thank you so much for those questions. So I'll first talk about like the question about the historical dimension of social reproduction. And I think that's where the work of Noelani and others who have been involved in the charter school movements in Hawaii, and charter schools in Hawaii have a different kind of history. They're not the kind of like ways of extracting and privatizing schools. It's a very different kind of history. And so it's actually very much tied to indigenous movements who have understood the limitations and in fact the outright violence that is done in the public school systems to teach students essentially how to hate themselves, how to think about their histories as essentially dead in the past and outmoded, irrelevant to the contemporary or irrelevant to the future. And so in that way, they're really taking ownership over the education of their children. And whether you're talking about Halo Kumana in urban Honolulu or Kanuoka Aina, a lot of them inform the movement at Mauna Kea. And some of the things that they do besides teaching the students how to grow and prepare their own food is also to kind of navigate using the stars, which is how Hawaii was first found. And so in the sophomore year of at Halau Kumana, students will actually sail a ship from Oahu to Hawaii Island and back just using the stars. And their navigation allows them to not just know where they are on the surface of the ocean, but where they are in the universe, because they understand where the other stars are, where the planets are. And that way of, what is called, like Epeli Ha'ofa refers to it as world enlargement, allows them to think and theorize from a place of abundance, not tiny little islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that is solely reliant on the continent or other places for its livelihood, but instead to really think about what exists within their cultures and how to provide for themselves. And I can think that gets me to the kind of the question about the spectacular. I kind of mentioned this question about, or this issue around slow resistance. And so it's really kind of playing off of Rob Nixon's Slow Violence, right? Where it's kind of like there's this climate change is not necessarily offering the kind of spectacles that allow it to be covered by the media, which then allows it to be on the front of everyone's minds. And so if that's what slow violence is, then what does slow resistance look like? I think slow resistance looks like growing your own food, creating a school. Those things are very slow. They're not spectacle driven, but they have huge ramifications for the community. And that is also kind of about social reproduction. So there's a way in which people simply become de-skilled in Hawaii. And many of the cultures and people who are, besides Kanaka Uiwi, native Hawaiians, but cultures and peoples who are displaced to Hawaii, they also have place-based wisdom and knowledge about how to sustain the conditions of life and have utilized those radical traditions in their movements against colonialism or racism or labor, et cetera. And so, yeah, I'll say that, and then I'll just kind of end by saying that and this is specific to Hawaii, and I'm just kind of adding to the conversation. I think it is actually very specific to Hawaii, but one of the ways in which the blockade in the early part of July, when we were at Pu'uhuluhulu and we were blocking the road, one of the reasons why we didn't get smashed by the police, they basically, so the kupuna, the elders, said they wanted to be on the first line. And they demanded that they be arrested first. And the elders were essentially what protected the encampment. Eventually the police did arrest the elders, and then the wahine, the women, created a line right behind them. But the police said, once the kupuna are arrested, they're coming in fast and hard. And so it was just kind of spur of the moment organizing, but the wahine made a line, and then the kane, the men, made a line behind them. And we were just waiting for the police to come in. They had LRADs, those sound cannons. Everyone knows what they look like, what the police look like at that point. But what saved us actually was the fact that everyone was tuning in. Everyone knew what was happening. And people made a commitment that once the kupuna were arrested, which was really a heartbreaking moment, other people on other islands started to block freeways and prevent tourists from reaching their flights to get to the airports. At Kahului, the Kahului airport, the Hilo airport, Oahu, Honolulu airports. And so there was a massive mobility and organizing that took place that protected the lines in that one place. And it's beautiful because that is, Mauna Kea is the pico of Hawaii. It is the belly button of Hawaii. It's the center of Hawaii. It is where the navigators who first found Hawaii are buried, in that place of reverence. And so absolutely those who are rooted are routed, and the routed are rooted, and all of that. But that is how people were able to protect themselves, at least just in that particular moment.
I will start with the second question. I don't think, again, spectacularity emerges by itself. It's made possible by what Dean has just called slow resistance. I mean, there is no, for example, occupation of a square without a whole labor that has been put into resistance movements, into their endurance. I mean, I know from Gezi, I know from Tahrir, I know from the whole, you know, what happened in Syria. These insurgencies did not emerge like just because, you know, something happened. There was so much labor by labor movements, for example, in Tunis or in Egypt, by environmental, ecological, and feminist movements, and the Kurdish movement in Turkey. So I don't, but spectacularity has, of course, is nice because that's the moment when you recognize yourself. I mean, it's very empowering for the opposition to recognize itself in a victory, in a moment of glory, because there are not, I mean, it's usually the whole the sphere of spectacularity is regulated by capital and by state. And when you can inject yourself into that visual world, that has an empowering effect. So I don't want to dismiss it either. On the other hand, with the I think the other question is I would like to reverse your question maybe. I think it's amazing, and I don't know how it is possible that people actually, so many people know how to limit the kind of power that is claimed within the commune, for example. I mean, I am more interested in that. Where do women know these things from, you know? And how is it possible that when a non-patriarchal space emerges, they can create wonders? Like we have a village, I mean, in North Syria, in Rojava, there is a women's village, Jinvar, that the fighters there have created, and women who have lost their loved ones or who were who faced domestic violence, or all these kinds of women who cannot, you know, anymore continue living in the places they lived, come to that village, and they have created an amazing life. When I go there, I feel I belong there, and that's what makes me surprised more. I mean, the possibilities that are opened when a space becomes, even for a moment, a non-state space, a non-patriarchal space, a space that is not ruled by capital. What wonders we are able to create. And we cannot find these, of course, in our past necessarily, because our past is also full of patriarchy, for example, in the Middle East. So we are, I mean, I'm not saying like, you know, capital came and ruined us. We have patriarchy for 5,000 years at least. And for 5,000, but through our struggles, when we create a non-patriarchal space, we also have a 5,000 years of knowledge of relating to each other in different ways and reproducing and sustaining them, actually. So I am more, yeah.
Thank you. I think we can start turning to the audience, if that's okay with everyone, in the sort of last 15, 20 minutes we have left. Maybe I just remind people that they can use the raise hand function and type in questions. Maybe while people are gathering their thoughts, I try to pose a quick question of my own that you can then leave and maybe just gather with other questions. But just to go back to this question of insurrection and autonomy, and maybe how it might be linked, that what we saw as this tension might be linked with the sort of indigenous imaginaries and anti-colonial imaginaries that are coming through as well. I don't think maybe the prompt was misleading in that sense, but I don't think the sense was that this is a binary or an opposition in any term. I think we accept that an isolated commune is a dead commune by all forms of measurement. I think the idea, and maybe the missing term here, is the state, right? The idea that the insurrectionary politics often gets mired in a modality of doing that is state-centered and it's the sort of state-oriented form or vision of revolutionary politics. And insofar as there was an existing critique of the sort of insurrections in Tahrir and otherwise that this sort of indexed kind of subtextually, it was that critique, which I don't think we endorse entirely or we subscribe to, but it is the critique that the insurrections were certainly defeated, I mean, it's not about the language of failure, but that they were defeated precisely at the point of transition. And what is the point of transition? The point of transition always revolves around a certain conception of a capture of state power, at least as an initial step, right? So you got these charges from sort of in classical terms, shall we say, that this was a kind of revolt without revolution, right? The Invisible Committee, famously, even though they're, you wouldn't associate them with the sort of classical orthodox political theory, made precisely that kind of charge, but that was pretty uniform, right? That you failed to kind of really disrupt economic infrastructure, that you were defeated in terms of, your kind of capture and storming of the palaces and the ministries, and that you don't really split the armed forces, right? Quite a classical conception of what, revolutionary action transition would look like. And the kind of, the sense that I think the prompts wanted to put forward, and I sort of reformulated as a question, was how do we get out of that sort of state-centered, state-focused? How far is the commune, especially in its sort of renewed encounter with the anti-colonial and in the indigenous, a way of short-circuiting that, right? And one of the ways I think we thought about that is that, yeah, there's this question of land dispossession, extraction, which came out, or subsistence, which came out in all of the sort of interventions. But there's also this temporal question, which is the short-circuiting of the kind of the pre and the post of capitalism and colonialism, that the communal imaginary somehow as a modality of action is prefigurative in a way that takes us, it goes back to something. You can see this in indigenous politics. You could also see it in European history. Bruno Bostiels makes the point that Marx, in letters I had never read, he writes about the commune in these letters, and he links it directly to dispossession and the agrarian question in Russia and Eastern Europe. So there are these connections, I think, and how, the prompt was supposed to be, how do we think about, this renewed encounter between dispossession as this modality, extraction, the question of land, and then the commune as a way of getting away from state capture as this sort of teleological end of insurrectionary or revolutionary action. I'm gonna leave that out there because I see some hands are raised and some things have come into the chat. So I'm gonna call on Zena Aga and then James Ivy to kind of to pose their questions. So you should be able to unmute yourselves now.
Yeah, I think I'm unmuted. Thank you, Nasser, for calling on me, and thank you all of you for your presentation. I thought it was really excellent and really inspiring, actually, in a kind of very emotional sense. I have a question about this theme of indigeneity that has come up, I think, in all of your speeches and your presentations. In Tuck and Yang's seminal 2012 piece, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, they draw a straight line between the Occupy movement and the French Revolution, as opposed to the revolution in Haiti and native struggle in Turtle Island. And they do that to essentially point out that the Occupy movement, for all of its sort of radical imagining, does at its core attempt to rescue, and this is their word, rescue settler futures. And so I'm intrigued as in all of the case studies that you've brought up and the research that you've done, how does insurrection, the commune, blockade, encampment, all of these moments tie into the work of decolonization, not as metaphor, but as the literal return of land from settler to native, and the restoration of indigenous life. And I think it's something that often gets, it was something I thought of, especially Dr. Clover, during your presentation, of the comparison between the two images, how in the first instance, of the mining community, that could be described as an attempt to rescue settler future because they're on unceded land, versus Standing Rock, which is an indigenous sort of moment of decolonization, or an attempt at decolonization, or praxis, decolonization and practice, actually, I think. So yeah, I would just love to hear some of your remarks on that. And my work in particular relates to Palestine and cartography, and then thinking about how to create alternative maps of Palestine that are decolonized. If the revolution were to happen tomorrow, what maps would emerge, and how do we map what is there and what could be, and how much of that is in reference to the past? And so it's from that spirit that I actually asked this question. So yeah, thank you for your time, and thanks in advance for your answers.
Thank you, Zaina, for that great question. James?
Yeah, hello. Thanks for calling on me, Nasser, and again, thank you everyone for their wonderful presentations. Like she said, this was very inspiring, and that kind of leads me to my question, which is, I'm considering sitting here in the middle of New York, what is the possible role of the urban in this? So in these forms of, what kinds of indigenous urban resistance can we envision as looking towards alternative forms of living? Because here in the city, we don't really have access to the resource-rich land where we might be able to build a sustainable self-defense. So what other ways can we look towards creating that? And into the future, into Joshua's points about the continuing hard work and struggle that will need to be done, what is the role of the urban in that? Because these cities are built as colonial structures. They are built and function around capitalism, and they exist in those forms. So how do we deal with that when trying to move into alternative forms?
I'm going to turn it back to the panelists because we're not too far off our sort of formal time. There's one more question in the chat, but maybe if anyone wants to kind of respond to some of that, we can take it from there.
I can take a fulfill my role as an icebreaker. And I want to thank you both for the questions. I'm gonna sort of take a stab first at Zaina's question in a way that I think or hope or fear also responds to Nasser's provocation, since I think those things go together. And it may be an answer that not everyone loves. For me, it involves like the unity implied in the term political economy, which is not just like a good name. It's an insistence that the political and the economic never be thought autonomously from each other, right? There's no such thing as an autonomous economic or an autonomous political movement, but that they're co-determining, unified, and so on. So, for example, in this question of like the limits of the insurrection in the Arab Spring, and I've actually written about this in several places, including the link that got put in the chat a while ago. Right? It turned out that initially quite moving, crowd demand that people want the fall of the regime proved to be a real limit, right? Because regimes fell. That turned out to be doable, and were replaced by regimes that were structurally identical or worse. And that counted for enough people as a victory. They successfully brought down a regime that it blunted the force of the ongoing insurrection enough to sort of bring it to a halt. The problem there, right, is the treatment of the political as autonomous without transforming the political economic structure. And that turns out to be a real limit of that kind of movement. Although again, I want to suggest this is conditioned by all kinds of affordances. It's not some sort of pure mental failing or something that people, oh, you didn't think about. That's not a very useful way to approach the matter. And I think that goes to Zaina's question, which I found that Tuck and Yang demand in that famous essay really important, especially as I live in a world where people are always like, we're going to decolonize the comp lit department. And you're like, well, what does that mean, my friend? at the same time, I think there's an account, not the only account at all, of decolonization, which also risks that separation of the political and the economic in certain ways. So if one imagined that that the land back movement was successful in some sort of formal way, where a vast amount of land in Turtle Island was, I don't want to use the word returned because that implies a kind of ownership, but was restored to relations with indigenous people. But you didn't transform capitalism in elsewhere. Capitalism is totalizing, right? Marx is not totalizing. Capitalism is totalizing, and Marx has a story about it. And capitalism is coming for that land again, right? It can't not. It can't not. So in that sense, a sort of purely formal decolonization in the sense of pure land back or whatever, that doesn't also focus on ending capitalism everywhere, is not going to be an adequate move. In that sense, right, I think the preserving settler futures versus not preserving settler futures is a useful frame, but not a complete frame for thinking about the problem. Since for me, it's either there's a concrete struggle, not just an abstract demand, to do away with capitalism as part of decolonization, or it's going to end up in a people want the fall of the regime cycle. So I think that like that initial insistence on the unity of the political economic is where you have to begin to think this problem from.
I'll just say really, really fast. So I've been thinking a lot about this question about futurity and turning to Edward Said's question of Palestine. And he has this one moment where he says the settler project seeks to cancel and transcend an actual reality by means of a future wish that the land may be made empty for development by a more deserving power. And in thinking about this question about like settler futurities, indigenous futurities, on the island that I'm from, actually it's in my background, in the Valleja are these 4 rivers, and the waters were expropriated in the 19th century for the expansion of sugar production. And recently there has been a move to return water to these rivers so that they can flow from mountain to ocean, but also so that farmers in the area can expand taro production, which was dramatically depleted as a result of sugar production. And a lot of the HCNS workers, the plantation workers who are not Kanaka, argued to Hawaiians and said, if you guys get your water back, we're going to lose our jobs. And Hokuwao Pellegrino, who is a taro farmer from the Valleja, responds at one of the water hearings and says, I may not be able to give 800 people jobs, but I can feed 800 people if I was able to grow on all of my land. And so there is a kind of way, I think, that in the same way that I think Eve Tuck theorizes futurity, like that from an indigenous perspective, settlers are always in the future. But from a kind of settler futurity, indigenous peoples and disabled peoples are never in the future. And so I think and that kind of brings me back to the other question about the indigeneity in urban spaces. And I'll just turn to like Leanne Simpson's work. And Leanne Simpson is really the key thinker about indigenous resurgence. But she says that she's always kind of asked this question about the urban. And she says, just because you can't fish in the river because it's polluted doesn't mean you can't kayak over the river, doesn't mean you can't paddle over the river. And so you can be in relation to place in different ways. And she says, just because the land is sick doesn't mean you abandon the land. You don't abandon your mother just because your mother is sick. And Sonara Taylor has been thinking about this phrase, disabled ecologies, and thinking about the ways in which disability might help us to really think about areas that are polluted, that are toxic. And we often presume that a place only has value if it's pristine, if it's giving us something. But disability helps us to understand these relations in non-normative ways. But I think there's also other ways that people are doing this kind of work, definitely being mindful of toxicity of soil, but vertical farms, vertical gardening. In the east side, Puerto Rican communities oftentimes created huge potted gardens. So I would just say, like, I'm not fully aware of like the urban spaces, but I would say that Hala Kumana, the school that I first talked about, is in the most urban places of Hawaii. That's where it exists. And that's where they were able to clean the river, to restore the Tara farm, and to help people to see what is possible in that space.
I'm gonna pass. I think, yeah, Dean and Joshua have said everything necessary. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you all. We're officially at time now. I'm sure there are a few more questions coming in, so I apologize if we haven't gotten to them now. What we tend to do is just sort of pause or stop the recording and yes, go to reception labs next, ideally. But we kind of give people space to just sort of mill around, I guess. Loiter would be a different way of putting it, and in lieu of just a very abrupt closure and a blank screen. But I just want to take this opportunity to thank our panelists, our guests, for these brilliant provocations and thoughts. It was really incredibly rich.